But in Shenzhen, I'm currently working with some people there. They're talking about the job and working, with this disbalance that really due to the very heavy traffic. They have to leave. But the people live in the very far suburban area of Shenzhen, but they have to work in the city center, even for cleaning stuff.
Yeah.
But they have this big data issues echo with your theory very perfectly.
So yeah, it'd be interesting to follow her.
Experience.
Saskia Sassen's classic image was in the sense of sort of globalization.
Yeah.
You look at any big corporate office in New York City, by day it's filled with day traders and merchant bankers who are paid a ton of money, and then in the evening cleaners come in who live in the far distant suburbs, and they're from Jamaica or from Mexico or whatever. So it's kind of globalized, but the day and night is really quite literally, it's a day and night kind of economy. And so I think there's looking at the nighttime economy, or that sort of would be an interesting angle on things.
Yes, thank you for that.
Yes.
Well, I think that quite connected to the issue of the government is also the issue of social movements. Because you mentioned among the few things which apparently are positive about this resurgence of the city. You just mentioned greener cities, bike lanes, for me, they're positive.
Sure.
Parks, etc. But most of the things you mentioned is just like a restructuring of inequality and new forms of segregation and new forms of displacement, exclusivity of the city center, etc. But just in the end, you just mentioned now that the right to the city apparently is something going on, something quite more demanded by more people. And I think we miss in your picture, your global picture, how these movements and how these demands are being pursued by different groups. How are they really impacting or balancing or counterbalancing all these tendencies that you mentioned? And I think it's quite important because otherwise it's easy to have the impression that all these phenomena and all these dynamics are sort of autonomous or independent from how governments and how citizens behave and interact. And to some extent, they also affect how cities are, how cities are shaped, right? So in some areas, this year, for example, when I was teaching my students about urban issues, we just screened the video of Columbia University expansion in New York, where there is a huge battle. Of course, the powerful, the power holders in this case are the university, all the big companies and the municipalities supporting them. But on the other hand, there were many community groups not just asking for compensation for the displacement, but also trying to reframe all these issues regarding heritage, regarding black culture, regarding Harlem, regarding appropriation of public spaces, etc., etc. So the whole history of the city is retold by these groups and who are actively seeking for the reappropriation of the city. And sometimes they win, sometimes they lose. But it's clear that these dynamics are, let's say, like re-emerging again as they were, to some extent, hidden since the 60s or 70s when people flew away to the suburbs. So I just wanted to know a bit what is your...
Sure, okay. I mean, I didn't discuss social movements, but I think you're right to challenge the notion that somehow or other these processes are over and above society or our ability to have some kind of either control over it or at least some critique of it. I haven't really worked with I think I've worked with specific community social movements. I think one of the things is I don't think they were separate. I mean, I didn't touch on that enough, but I gave the urban ecologies as if it was just kind of bike lanes. But there actually is a sort of urban political ecology, I think, that's very strong about not only a greener city, but a fairer, greener city. In the sense of like changing the carbon footprint is also about increasing the viability of public transport. So one of the things I would argue that the best thing you could do for the poor, and I'd say in the policy response, is to get better public transport, no doubt about that, and cheaper public transport. The problem is, actually, I do think there is an issue with social movements at the moment. And the issue is, actually, it's quite a disparate experience. And what I mean by that is, one of the things when poverty, so just taking the US, when poverty is suburbanized, it becomes atomized, right? So there's poor people in, apartment blocks here, apartment blocks there. It's quite literally, it's quite difficult to get general social movements because the nature of is a fragmentation. So I think we're at a period, it was easier to have social movements when you had trade union movements, the whole creation of a working class came about, in at least England, the E.P. Thompson classic argument comes about because you have concentrated workers who could see their own, not only their own self-interest, but their own collective interest. One of the things I'd argue, I think, is that we're in a difficult time because social movements have a harder time making a case because they're actually more fragmented and more atomized. In the US, they're doubly fragmentized because in the sense it becomes like, so the black culture argument is often in the US cities at the expense of Mexican culture or something. It becomes a zero-sum game. It becomes like an ethnic trumping one or the other. Now we do have some sort of rainbow coalition, but the last rainbow coalition in the US that had any political thing was in the 80s. So I think we're going through a period where in the US, and I don't always speak about the US, you're actually getting the ethnic identity thing, the sense of our culture, actually becomes also a form of fragmentation. It becomes like Mexican American, Black American, the Irish American experience. And so one of the things is the ethnic basis becomes fragmentary. So I think what I'm trying to say is I didn't touch it upon my talk because it mainly US, and I didn't touch it upon my talk because I'm not quite sure what's happening there, to be honest. I'm not quite sure. I think we're at a period of fragmentation, and it's difficult to get collective notions that but especially if you think about it, one of the things that's happened in the last 20, 30 years, there's been an identification of different communities, right? So the black experience was ignored in the US or whoever, or the gay experience was ignored. In the last 20 years, what we've seen is the creation of, kind of a queer culture, an explicit queer culture, an explicit black culture, an explicit whatever, reclaiming our history. So in Scotland, for example, Scotland's breaking off from England, right? So a lot of these things at the moment we're in a period where people are reclaiming difference, highlighting difference. Difference is good. And I'm not arguing with that, but what that means is it makes a very difficult basis then to get wider right to the city arguments that are slightly more inclusive. Because at the moment we're in the argument where anything that doesn't mention my kind of culture is somehow or other disrespecting it. Right? So I think we're just in a period of, as I see it, man, maybe I'm kind of wrong, I see a kind of bit slightly more fragmentation, a sense of different groups identifying themselves, and then we're kind of going to move on, I think, maybe in some time later, hopefully fairly soon. So, does that make sense? Does that? Whether you agree with that or not, I think that would be my argument. That doesn't explain, I think I could still do a lot more work looking at a much finer grained analysis of social movements in particular places. So for example, those townhomes I showed you in Washington DC, there is one of the things that happened, there was a black community that was there. They was actually quite spread, actually lost their homes. Now they were told that they were going to come back, but there was a dispersal. And so one of the things you've had this you've had a fragmentation and then a dispersal. And that's difficult to concentrate. And so it would be interesting to find out, okay, how would you get movements of cross-cultural, dispossessed, that are dispersed. Kind of tricky. Now, one of the counter arguments would be, well, that's what social media is. And so I do know people now looking at communities on social media. And so one of the things, you may be made chaotic or fragmented, but you still have social media. That's how diasporas are kind of kept alive. And that would be one way, I think. I think maybe, and we've been still looking for demonstrations or policies, and maybe, there's maybe more work in social media to be done now.